It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Paul Saffo. Paul is a mediaX distinguished visiting scholar and a Silicon Valley based forecaster with over 3 decades of experience in helping both government and corporate clients understand and respond to the dynamics of large scale, long term change and those changes that are present complex challenges. So, Paul, we're eager to hear from you. Paul's topic today is how to think like a civilization.
Great. Thanks, Martha. And thank you especially for overselling me. But good, let's get started here. My focus is on how to think like a civilization. But more precisely, I think we had better start thinking like a civilization because the current order is not quite working. And thanks to the brilliant Tom Gauld, who points out that this process of relying on leaders is sort of falling apart, and we need to approach things in a different way. So the departure point is just recognizing what is obvious to all of us. We live in an age of a waning nation state order. Um, if there was more time, we could go all the way back to the Treaty of Westphalia and the like, but really the modern chapter begins with the first IGO, the United Nations, the rise of NGOs, and a crucial point was in 1948, the UDHR, which represented a fundamental shift. It was the first time in the history of international law that individuals were granted standing as persons at international law. Before that, only states could be persons recognized at international law and the like. Um, Another key marker was in 2008 when we saw the population shift from this planet being a majority rural population to being majority urban. New York, of course, thought it happened 100 years earlier, but it really only happened in 2008. And the media angle, in many ways, was the most important. And that was the media, in my opinion, media-driven shift towards globalization. There are, of course, academics who talk about globalization going all the way in the past, centuries. But I mark it from 1967, when we had that famous first image of Earth by the ATS-3 ComSat. And it recognizes the fact that globalization is as much a media event as it is anything else. And what we're seeing today is a shift. Some argue it's a shift from nation state to city state. And I've argued that in the past, but I now have my doubts. But just some data points. California, our little state, is the world's 5th largest economy. And Gavin Newsom has taken to expressly referring to it as a nation state. So it's an indicator that the regions are showing their muscle and pushing back at the center in Washington, D.C. But of course, maybe California isn't the right unit. It's a little big. I would argue that the San Francisco Bay Area is a perfect example of a city-state. We'd be the world's 18th largest economy. Um, a city-state is a place that's big enough to have global impact. Think about Google, Facebook, and Twitter and all the other things we've exported, but small enough that everybody knows where they fit. They know where what their role is, and there's an intimacy lacking at the national level. What other place refers to its CEOs as Steve or Zuck, even though they've never actually met those people in person? It's one thing to say, wow, this is great. We've got city states and nation states are waning. The question is, can city states solve our problems? If larger units like nation states could not tackle global problems, it is quite likely that city states are going to do an even worse job of tackling the problems. And as an example of the problems we have, this is the list of global challenges that the Millennium Project, which works closely with the UN, puts out. Energy, organized crime, peace and conflict, any single one of these, that obviously cities have a role in this, but we need some bigger organizing principle. So I want to give you a tool for thinking about this. This is something I talked about in 2018, and I'm just touching on some top level elements. This was conceived of by Stuart Brand in the 1990s, and Stuart and I have carried on a 20-year conversation about it. It's called pace layers. It's borrowed from architecture. And in architecture, they talk about shear layers, the fast and slow parts of a building. Fast, who comes and goes, slow, the structure and the like. So you can think of this as the stack of civilization. The top layers move fast, like fashion, as Martha suggested. Commerce is a little more slow, quarterly, annually. Infrastructure, 50 to 70 years. Governance, is pretty steady. Here in the United States, we have a revolution about every 130 years. The American Revolution, the Civil War, we might be overdue. And then culture moves more slowly and nature slowest of all. But there is the reverse, the inverse, when lower layers move faster than upper layers. And that's what we call revolutions. When things happen down at the bottom and bubble upwards, it creates all sorts of surprise and turbulence. That's a moment we're in today in many ways. Coronavirus is a case where nature suddenly delivered a surprise that's working its way all the way up to the top. And as Martha correctly noted, it's even affecting fashion. So I will have to redraw that arrow to go up even higher. So thinking about this in a civilization context, upper layers get the attention, but lower layers have the power. Lower layers are the things that really determine context. And there's more about this in my 2018 talk. I just want to note it and move on. The other aspect for us in Silicon Valley is innovation and action happen at the boundary between two layers. And the metaphor to think about is these layers are moving at different speeds. And that means because of the move at different speeds, there's inevitably turbulence between the layers. And that is productive turbulence. That works for us in Silicon Valley. A metaphor is this picture of Jupiter, thanks to NASA. Those lovely swirling things, those are called Kelvin Helmholtz instability. You can get the same effect if you have some hot coffee in a clear glass mug and you pour in some milk, you'll get those wonderful swirls. That's where the action is. You all are right there. This is Silicon Valley. The big whirls, that's the great red spot. It's been there for a couple of centuries. The big whirls are the established companies. Today, it's Facebook and Google. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it was Hewlett Packard and Apple. And all those little tiny whirls are the startups coming out of the turbulence, coming down at the bottom. And the great red spot, as we know, is getting smaller. And of course, the little tiny whirls, who knows? Hidden in there is the next big great red spot. And to use the valley example, hidden in there is the next Facebook and Google and the like. The difference between fast and slow layers is fast layers learn, slow layers remember. Fast layers propose, slow layers dispose. So building on Martha's fashion example, this is where, those two layers together, I'm old enough to have seen bad fashion ideas from several decades ago come around again. And let's face it, photo gray lenses and leisure suits were a bad idea the first time. So we remember and we throw things out. Fast layers absorb shocks. Slow layers integrate shocks. I'm going to come back to that, but just note also, fast layers tend to be discontinuous, slow layers continuous. Fast layers innovate, slow layers constrain. But that absorb shocks and integrate shocks is really relevant today. The upper layers are the fire trucks and lower layers are the architects. The pandemic was the most predicted event in my professional career as a forecaster. After that, the earthquake is the second most predicted thing. And think about it. When a quake hits, the fire trucks, their job is to respond quickly and put the fire out. And the lower layers are the urban planners and the architects to say, how do we make our houses more resilient and the like? So let me carry that forward into civilizational thinking. Here are the principles I think civilizational thinkers should have. Think long, think deep, think outside the layer. And again, our time is short, so I want to focus specifically on the culture layer, because culture is the zone. We briefly hinted about myths. Culture is where myths come out of, and culture and myth is, of course, a media phenomena. Those myths, if we get the myths right, they can be a source of enormous strength. In my opinion, today in the United States, well, let me give you an example first, and I'll give you what I think is wrong. Lower layers are sources of renewal. Last year, when Notre Dame burned and everybody in Paris stood in shock and watched it burn, well, what's going to renew Notre Dame is culture. In the United States right now, culture for us is a problem because we have the wrong myth. We have the myth of independence that's brought from the past, and we haven't been able to replace it with the myth of interdependence. And until we get a new myth of interdependence, where, as the saying goes, we can stand on each other's shoulders instead of standing on each other's toes, the United States is going to be stuck. Fast gets the attention, but slow has the power. Just ask a coronavirus. This was the most avoidable pandemic in history. We not only, missed all the warnings, we systematically dismantled our guards at the border, our public health system, and we disregarded their advice. In China, after the SARS outbreak, they built what they thought was a politician-proof surveillance and warning system. And it turned out it was not politician-proof. We put way too much response on fire trucks and way too little response on the architects and the builders. And then on top of everything else, we're so stupid that the way we responded to this virus pandemic, I'll stop ranting in a second, as if saying, hey, we haven't had a fire in a while. Let's tear down those fire stations because we can rebuild them next time we need them. It was in the 1970s when climate change became an issue and the government stepped in and said, we need data. Let's go take over that guy's work. Luckily, they failed, and the Keeling Curve project continues today. The lesson is this: slow and obscure always wins over fast and flashy. If you want to create a myth, if you want to make civilization, do not pre-announce your jailbreak. Find some obscure corner, give it a really boring name, and that's how you change the world.
You've inspired me, and I think all of us, Paul, to think of global villages and to create global institutions that may be politician proof. Um, that's a tall task. But also to think of media as civilization and the importance of digital technologies in that.